Gildan Media, a division of Recorded Books, presents Irony and Sarcasm by Roger Kreuz, narrated by Joel Richards. Introduction. This book is the biography of a troublesome word. Irony is a term that everyone uses and seems to understand. It is also a concept that is notoriously difficult to define. Much like Winona Ryder's character in the 1994 rom-com Reality Bites, whose inability to describe irony costs her a job interview. We know it when we see it, but nonetheless have trouble articulating it. Even worse, it seems as if the same term is used to describe very different things. And following your mother's advice, to look it up in the dictionary, is liable to leave you even more confused than before. Irony isn't a loner. It spends a lot of time in the company of a shady relative with a checkered reputation. The nature of their relationship, however, is obscure. Sarcasm could be thought of as irony's evil twin, or perhaps they are better described as siblings or simply as cousins. Sarcasm is also a bit two-faced, with a penchant for hostility as well as for humor. Psychology today has characterized sarcasm as one of the worst destroyers of intimacy. On the other hand, a recent article in the Washington Post described sarcasm as a characteristic that many people seek out in their romantic partners. It has also been described as the lowest form of wit and the highest form of intelligence. This observation has often been attributed to Oscar Wilde. Ironically, it does not appear in his published work. It does, however, capture the yin and yang of sarcasm fairly well. Examples of confusion about these terms appear regularly in the news and in popular culture. An American president posts a tweet containing the phrase, "Isn't it ironic?" and is derided for misusing the term. When criticized for thanking Russia for embassy staff reductions, he claims he was being sarcastic. A North Korean dictator bans sarcasm directed at him and his regime because he fears that people are only agreeing with him ironically. A song about irony is mocked because its lyrics contain non-ironic examples. And a character in one of the most popular programs on television is a brilliant physicist who nonetheless doesn't seem to understand sarcasm. In short, uncertainty about irony and sarcasm can be found almost everywhere. The term irony has been applied to a number of different phenomena over time, and as a label it has been stretched to accommodate a number of new senses. But do they all truly belong together under the same conceptual umbrella? And exactly how does irony differ from sarcasm, as well as from related concepts like coincidence, paradox, satire, and parody? The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein proposed that members of a category can be said to share a family resemblance. That is, members of a family look more like each other than they look like others who are not part of their clan. Not everyone in the same family will share the same nose, ears, or chin. They may not all have the same stature or build, but they will have an overlapping set of resemblances that, when taken together, strongly suggest that a given individual is a part of a particular family. Wittgenstein originally used the notion of family resemblance to make sense of troublesome concepts like game. The number of players, rules, equipment, and scoring may vary widely, but we nonetheless refer to solitaire, poker, chess, and football as members of the game category. We can profitably apply a similar logic to disentangling the concept of irony in its many forms. This approach can also help us to differentiate phenomena that are often seen as being related to irony. Family resemblance can help us to understand why, for example, it makes sense to refer to particular situations and verbal constructions as ironic. And it can help to explain why certain non-ironic phenomena, such as paradox, satire, and parody, are sometimes characterized as members of the irony family. For Wittgenstein, category membership is probabilistic as opposed to absolute. Therefore, if a non-member possesses several attributes that are characteristic of the concept, cases of mistaken identity may well occur. One goal of this book is to identify the attributes that constitute a family resemblance for the irony concept. This book also surveys the empirical research that is being conducted on irony and sarcasm. Sarcasm, in particular, is a topic of inquiry for experimental psychologists and linguists because it illuminates many important aspects of communication and miscommunication. An appreciation of why people choose to express themselves in such ways and how they go about signaling these intentions will greatly enrich our understanding of language and behavior. The story of the life and times of irony is fascinating and richly textured. It spans ancient Greek philosophy and Roman rhetoric, as well as modern literary criticism and media studies. It has also evolved and adapted, mutating from a verbal figure of speech into written and online forms. And as an attitude, it continues to be both admired and vilified. In short, its multifaceted nature can tell us a great deal about what it means to be human. Roger Kreuz, March 2019, Memphis, Tennessee. 1. Some preliminaries. Non-literal language. People use verbal irony and sarcasm to say things they don't literally mean. Although scholars debate the meaning of the word literal, for our purposes it is good enough to define it as language that is simple, direct, and unambiguous. A literal message doesn't require any additional context to be understood, and it has no hidden motive or agenda that we must infer. The message is the message. 2 and 2 add up to 4. At first blush, it might seem that literal language would be the ideal form of communication. It's clear, easy to understand, and unlikely to be misunderstood. However, if people only employed literal language, it would render communication devoid of nuance, innuendo, humor, and poetic turns of phrase. Communication would be straightforward, but also incredibly dull. Non-literal turns of phrase like variety are the spice of life and of language. As it turns out, verbal irony is but one example of a far larger family of speech forms that deviate from literal meaning. Such figurative or non-literal language has been an object of study for millennia. Traditionally, it was the province of poetry and literary criticism. More recently, it has become a topic of inquiry for cognitive scientists and computational linguists. Taken as a whole, such turns of phrase are referred to as figures of speech, and they constitute an important part of the modern discipline of rhetoric. Because of this rich and varied history, a formidably dense vocabulary has evolved to catalog the many forms that such language can take. Many dozens, and possibly hundreds of such figures have been described and studied. Fortunately, we don't need to consider all such figures of speech for our purposes. Many of them, such as alliteration, are primarily ornamental in nature. We could replace a phrase like the fickle finger of fate with the capricious nature of destiny without really changing its meaning. It is the repetition of sounds in the first expression, however, that makes the phrase noteworthy or memorable. The goal of this section is to highlight only the forms of non-literal language that deviate from a speaker's literal meaning. This is the attribute that these forms of language share with verbal irony, and many are used in the service of irony. Before going any further, therefore, it will be helpful to introduce the cast of figurative forms that irony frequently associates with. Let's start with metaphor. A statement like, "The lecture was a sleeping pill," isn't literally true. A speech isn't a drug, but the sentence makes sense if we map a salient attribute of sleeping pills, things that induce drowsiness, onto the concept of lectures, thus making the point that the lesson was exceedingly tedious or boring. In the case of metaphor, such a comparison is implicit. We can accomplish a similar trick by using a simile, but in this case the comparison is explicit, as in, "The lecture was like a sleeping pill." In other cases, a statement can allude to something in a more arbitrary way. Idioms are expressions like paint the town red or yellow belly, to mention two colorful examples. They have no obvious connection to their reference, such as a celebration or cowardice, but they have nevertheless become associated with them. In a similar way, phrases like pushing up daisies, bite the dust, or buy the farm are euphemisms that we use to avoid speaking directly about unpleasant topics, such as death. Instead of claiming that A is B, or that A is like B, non-literal language can stretch the truth in other ways as well. Language of this kind can make the attributes of something, like its dimensions or duration, greater or smaller than they really are. A thirsty restaurant patron, recounting the story of her privation, might claim that she had to wait for 1,000,000 years before a waiter brought her water. This form of non-literal language goes by a variety of names, such as exaggeration, overstatement, and hyperbole. The reverse is a frequently employed tactic as well. Someone who comments that a train is a little behind schedule when it has really been delayed for several hours would be employing understatement. This form of non-literal language also goes by other names, such as meiosis and litotes. Then we have the questions that aren't truly questions. A statement like, "Isn't it hot in here?" can function literally as an observation about temperature. However, such remarks are often intended as requests that someone do something, like open a window. In languages like English, indirect requests, such as, "Do you know what time it is?" or "Can you pass the mustard?" are polite ways of issuing commands. Other ostensible inquiries are rhetorical questions, such as, "How old are you? 3?" or "Just who do you think you are?" In these cases, the speaker is expressing frustration or annoyance, and no response, other than perhaps an apology, is expected or desired. Another form of non-literal language is antiphrasis, which involves saying the opposite of what is literally meant. Although this applies to many instances of verbal irony and sarcasm, it is important to note that these terms are not synonymous. Many ironic statements do not mean the opposite of what is literally said, a point that we will return to later. In addition, not all examples of antiphrasis are ironic. When someone voices a complaint to a sympathetic coworker and she replies, "Tell me about it," she truly does intend the opposite. That is, "Don't tell me about it." The antiphrasis, however, is not ironic. The responder is employing a conventionalized expression to voice agreement and perhaps solidarity. In a similar way, an assessment of "not bad" is a routine way of declaring that something is quite good. It makes little sense to characterize "not bad" and similar expressions as ironic. We can more accurately characterize them as examples of antiphrasis or understatement, or even as clichés. True irony involves other preconditions and intentions. Guides for the perplexed? Dictionary. Opinion expressed as truth in alphabetical order. John Ralston Saul, The Doubter's Companion. The term irony and its variant forms have been used, over time, to refer to a number of different concepts. These distinctions in meaning are sometimes subtle, and they are also changeable. It's reasonable to assume, therefore, that curious readers and careful writers will seek guidance from reference works like dictionaries. Professional writers and journalists may go a step further and consult style guides that provide suggestions about usage for specific publications, such as magazines and newspapers. In general, such reference books are extremely helpful, but for slippery concepts like irony, we find considerable variation in the amount of guidance they provide. One reason for this discrepancy has to do with two competing schools of thought about the purpose of such books. Everyone has an intuitive sense about the proper use of language in speech and writing, however nebulous that concept may be. And this sense leads us to believe that a standardized, correct form of the language can be codified into a reference work, like a dictionary. People who have strong opinions on this matter are called prescriptivists. They believe that the purpose of dictionaries is to make unambiguous pronouncements about the proper usage of words. The task of the lexicographer, therefore, should be to decree what is correct and standard, and to exclude that which is ungrammatical, dialectical, colloquial, or otherwise non-standard. In general, dictionaries compiled until the mid-20th century were prescriptive in nature, with perceived non-standard usage clearly labeled as such. A good example is the traditional treatment of hopefully. Its correct usage was decreed to be as an adverb meaning in a hopeful way, as in, she stared hopefully at the instructions. However, its use as a disjunct, in the sense of, it is hoped, hopefully she will read the instructions, has been considered non-standard and something to avoid. An obvious problem with such distinctions is that many types of non-standard usage, such as employing hopefully as a disjunct, are extremely common and are used by large numbers of well-educated individuals. A shift in the field of linguistics has been pushing practitioners of the discipline in a different direction. Instead of deciding what people ought to say and write, many linguists believe their goal should be to document and describe how people use language and how this usage changes over time. This is called descriptivism, and it is anathema to those inclined toward prescriptivism. Prescriptivists argue that descriptivism is an abdication of linguistic responsibility, a surrender to the forces of subjectivity and relativism, and a capitulation to barbarians intent on debasing some pure form of the language. The debate between prescriptivists and descriptivists puts lexicographers in an awkward position. Should they continue their traditional role as linguistic gatekeepers, calling balls and strikes with regard to usage? Or should they embrace the language as a living and changing organism? In short, should they think of themselves as umpires or as biologists? The first steps toward a more descriptivist lexicography were taken by G&C Merriam, publisher of the premier unabridged reference work of American English. Its New International Dictionary, released in 1934, was a traditionally prescriptivist tome. The company spent several years preparing a revision, and the release of Webster's Third New International Dictionary in 1961 provoked a firestorm of controversy. Prescriptivists viewed the new work as unconscionably permissive, in part because many of the usage notes from the previous edition, such as colloquial or improper, had been eliminated. The criticism led to an attempt by the publisher of American Heritage magazine to purchase Merriam, so that these wrongs could be righted. The failure of that effort led to the creation of a competitor, the American Heritage Dictionary of the English Language, AHD, first published in 1969. In pointed contrast to the Merriam Dictionary, American Heritage assembled a usage panel of prominent writers, editors, and scholars. The dictionary contains several hundred usage notes based on surveys of this group. Other dictionary publishers fall somewhere in between taking descriptive and prescriptive approaches in their own reference works. As a result, the guidance provided for words like irony will vary considerably depending on the dictionary. Those who look up irony in AHD will encounter several definitions, followed by a nearly 200-word usage note, along with data from the dictionary's usage panel. The Random House Webster's Unabridged Dictionary, 2nd edition, provides an extensive note distinguishing between irony, sarcasm, and satire, but cites no experts for the usage suggestions. And reference works produced by Merriam, now known as Merriam-Webster, typically provide illustrations of actual use, but little in the way of additional guidance. But what of the most unabridged of all English dictionaries, the multi-volume Oxford English Dictionary, OED? Its first edition was published in parts over 4.5 decades, from 1884 to 1928. A second edition, incorporating 4 volumes of new material, was released in 1989. 3 volumes of supplements followed during the 1990s. Work on a third edition, a complete overhaul that will exist only online, began in 2000. This history is relevant for a consideration of the OED's treatment of irony because the section containing words running from invalid to Jew was originally published in December 1900. As a result, the core of the OED's treatment of the concept in the 1989 edition, the 20-volume set found in most libraries, is well over a century old. It provides the reader with many examples from literary works, but no usage guidance. The 1993 supplementary volume adds a definition for and examples of dramatic irony. Today's online edition, which exists behind a paywall, received a thorough overhaul in September 2013, along with a usage note beginning with the admission that the precise application of the term has varied over time and remains the subject of much discussion. Do style guides, such as those published by the New York Times or the Associated Press, provide any helpful suggestions about how to deal with irony and its related terms? By definition, such guides are prescriptive, since they are defining a particular house style or advocating for a specific standard. Such style guides have a long history in English, from the exuberantly prescriptive opinions of H.W. Fowler, found in his Dictionary of Modern English Usage, to those of his intellectual heir, Brian Garner. Garner does, however, recognize that language is a living organism and that judgments of acceptability can change over time. In his guide, he employs a 5-point language change index to assign scores for word choice cases, ranging from rejected through widespread to fully accepted. In addition, his scores are based on objective, verifiable linguistic data. These diverse definitions and usage suggestions will appear in the relevant sections of the chapters that follow. Hopefully, it is hoped that, the context I have provided here will make it easier to understand both the utility and the drawbacks of using reference works to corral a concept as unruly as irony. 2. The varieties of ironic experience. Irony has meant and means so many different things to different people that rarely is there a meeting of minds as to its particular sense on a given occasion. Jonathan Tiedler, Approximately Irony. Getting to grips with irony seems to have something in common with gathering the mist. There is plenty to take hold of if only one could. D.C. Mukey, The Compass of Irony. What does it mean to refer to a person, a situation, or a statement as ironic? In this chapter, I describe 8 different ways in which the term irony is used. Although these forms of irony refer to a wide variety of diverse phenomena, they do share an overlapping set of attributes that create a family resemblance. Socratic irony. Socrates. "Oh, dear Hippias, might you do me this little favor, not to jeer at me if I struggle to understand the things you say and keep asking questions about them? Please do try to go easy on me and answer gently." Plato, attributed. Hippias Minor. The Greek philosopher Socrates is well known to us as a historical figure, even though he did not commit his ideas to any written medium. His primary claim to fame may be his starring role in the dialogues, fictional conversations, written by his student Plato. In many of these works, Socrates engages in an extended disquisition about a particular topic, such as rhetoric, Gorgias, or justice, Crito, Republic. Although Socrates uses a number of argumentative styles in the dialogues, he is well known for one strategy in particular, claiming ignorance of a particular topic, so as to draw out his interlocutor's assumptions and beliefs. In some cases, his assertion of ignorance may have been genuine. In others, however, it seems that Socrates was only pretending to be uninformed. And it is this rhetorical tactic that has become known as Socratic irony. References to Socrates and irony turn up several times in Plato's writings. In one of the dialogues, Callicles admonishes Socrates for trying to trap people with words and for being ironic. In another, Thrasymachus scornfully refers to Socrates' habitual irony and asserts that Socrates would do anything rather than answer if someone asks him about something. In Plato's account of speeches given at a banquet, a drunk Alcibiades accuses...
We hope you enjoyed this preview. To continue listening to this audiobook on Google Play Books, use the link in the video description.